It is time for Dying to Bloom.
Good morning and welcome to Dying to Bloom. I'm Kerry Potter and this is the monthly radio show that reminds you that you are mortal. We are all destined to die. Really, the reason I do this show is to help all of us learn about our burial choices and to consider the cost as well as the environmental impact. You know, the funeral industry is a $16 billion a year industry, and the average funeral costs around $7,000 to $10,000. So as you tune into this show, which airs the fourth Thursday of the month, right after the Stephen Meredith morning show, I'd like you to consider some types of things, such as what kind of funeral do you want to have? What funeral provider should you use? What are you legally required to buy? Should you bury or cremate the body or donate it to science? And what are the choices for a green funeral and burial? What other arrangements should you make? And of course, how much is it all going to cost? These are all important things to consider, and one of the reasons why I have this show. I also, of course, spend a lot of time promoting green burial, and I asked you to consider donating to the Green Cemetery Fund through the Rockland Community Foundation at rocklandgives.org to help bring a green cemetery to the Rockland County area, which is basically beautifully preserved land where people are also buried. There's no headstones, no embalming, no hardwood caskets. Instead, perhaps the infinity burial suit, which was featured on last month's show. And that also reminds me, all previous shows can be found on the Dying to Bloom YouTube channel, thanks to my friend Jeff Lewis from Group M Marketing. We do have a guest joining us today, and our topic today is going to be cremation. You know, many times when I'm preaching about green cemeteries, people respond to me by saying, I know what I'm doing, I'm getting cremated. Well, that's the topic of today's show. And our guest today is Sara Marsden, Director of Communications at DFS Memorials. Sara, good morning.
Good morning, Kerry. How are you?
Good. Thank you for joining us today on Dying to Bloom.
Happy to join you today. Thank you for inviting me.
Before we dig right in there, and that's kind of funny, before we get into the topic of cremation, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what DFS Memorials is?
Well, my husband and I set up US Funerals Online a number of years ago after our own personal experience of dealing with the death and realizing at that time that there was very little information actually online to assist families. So that's sort of how we actually got into the whole death business at the time. And we operated US Funerals as just an information portal for families for many years. And it was in recent years when we really saw a change in the industry in the US, with more and more people really not being able to afford traditional expensive funerals. And we were being asked so much more about more affordable options. And obviously cremation started to really appear as a more affordable option for many families. And so we set up DFS Memorials really as a means to help families locate more affordable options for burial or cremation. But for us, primarily at the moment, it is more a drive that people are asking for cremation services.
So you're not a funeral director yourself, but you're more of an information source.
That's correct, yes. We don't actually directly provide any funeral services. We help families connect with a low-cost, local family funeral home in their area that we know will guarantee to offer them more affordable services and that offer kind of open disclosure about pricing. This industry for a long time has hidden behind curtains of not really liking to disclose to families up front how much services are going to cost. And really in today's kind of economic climate, families really need to know up front, what services are likely to cost them. And it's obviously when people are dealing with the grieving and they're dealing with the death, in many ways they've been made to feel it's not dignified to actually ask how much. And so that's what we kind of try and help advocate for and encourage families that, there is nothing undignified about price shopping around or, boldly asking how much is this going to cost? Do I need these services? So we really try and act as an advocate between families and funeral homes to ensure that families are protected to somewhat, from really being, spending unnecessarily on funeral costs.
Do you have any idea how many crematories there are in the United States?
I don't have an exact figure, but what I can tell you is that there are many, many more opening now. We're dealing with a lot of the funeral homes that we work with in the network are now adding their own crematories as opposed to just working with, one crematory in the area that all the funeral homes would transfer the deceased to for the cremation, whereas now many are opening their own. I know New York is a slightly different state in that a funeral home is not actually allowed to operate a crematory in New York. So all the crematories that operate are either sort of municipally owned or the not-for-profit crematories in New York.
That's interesting. And so in other states, a funeral home may be able to also have a crematory on location on their site.
Absolutely, and for many families, it gives them a greater reassurance that they know that their loved one is going into the funeral home, will be cared for in that funeral home, will be cremated in that funeral home, and they will collect the remains from that funeral home. So, many funeral homes now across the US are opting to put in a crematory because they feel that gives their families a greater reassurance. I think we're always, one of the biggest questions we're asked about cremation is, how do I know I'm getting my loved one back? And so I think for families where they can feel that funeral home that they, engage to deliver the services, they know that their loved one's going to remain in that premises throughout the whole process, makes them feel a lot more comfortable about it. And it's really quite sad that in New York there are laws in place that are actually preventing this from happening, that are preventing funeral homes in New York from actually installing their own crematory machines.
That's interesting that you said that. I've been doing a little research on cremation, and there are a few nightmare stories of people not getting their loved ones back. However, there are procedures that are in place that crematories must follow, and I thought it was a pretty interesting process that along with the regulations, a crematory has a process of having a metal disc with a unique ID number that stays with the remains from when it's received at the crematory throughout the cremation process, and then it's attached to the remains container. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I saw a little video on it, and it looked to me similar to a dog tag that, again, when the body arrives, I guess, at the crematory, they get assigned a number. They have this metal disc that stays with the body, and that actually stays with the body through the cremation process. And then when the body is removed from the cremating process, that ID tag is still with the cremains and then goes on the outside of the container. So I think it's interesting for people to know that if they are concerned about not getting their loved ones back, there is an identification regulation process
there
in
is
place.
An absolute process, and obviously all registered crematories and funeral homes are adhering to this process quite, rigorously, really. I think when you mention there are an odd horror story, you hear the odd, we got the wrong remains back, but we also hear the same stories. I've heard them about, they buried the wrong body. So, yes, there are very, very rare occasions that things like this do happen. But in the main, these are just very rare one-off occurrences. The majority of registered funeral homes are following very rigid processes, and they take it very seriously. To them, this is the fact that they're cremating the body doesn't mean they treat it with any less respect than if they were burying it. So, I think it's just a different process, really.
Well, I do like the idea, and I guess you mentioned that some crematories or funeral homes allow the family to be present through the process. I understand why people may not want to be there, but me being someone who is an advocate for green burial, I also, I think, would like the opportunity to be there for my loved one. And I believe there are some religions that practice that as well, so I guess crematories have to be able to accommodate that.
Yes, that's correct. There are, and most facilities will actually accommodate that because they do realise that some faiths actually, it's an important part of their faith that they can be there to commence the cremation. We have a few providers that we work with who have even responded to this, where they've installed their own crematory, and they've actually created quite a nice little sort of viewing room to the side that's very tasteful. So it has a little curtain, and it's not like, oh my God, here's a big furnace, and it's all done very tastefully, but it does enable the family to see, for themselves, there was the casket entering in. Little curtain closes, the button can be pressed, and it is all, very tasteful, but it does allow families to have that connection to the process, really, that for many families is an important part of the ritual, in some ways. So.
Let's talk about the history of cremation a little bit. At least in the United States here, there was a time when it was considered desecrating the body to be cremated, and it was not really a popular option. I do have a quote here from the clevelandcremation.com. That's where I got this information from. It said in the year 1920, the U.S. had only 20 working crematories in 1920. But by the year 2003, in the U.S., we were home to more than 1,890 crematories. And, of course, that's 2003, so I'm sure that's grown a lot since then.
I'm quite sure it's grown a lot, yes. Yeah, in the last sort of 13 years, because that's when we've really seen the spike in cremation.
Right. And the National Funeral Directors Association says that 45% of those who died in 2015 were cremated, and that was up 32% from 2005, and they're projecting it to be 70% by 2030. Well, obviously this is becoming more of a popular choice. Why would you say people are going towards cremation?
I think there are several influencing reasons. I do think cost is one big reason for many, many people, because the cost of a cremation is probably at least a third of the cost of a traditional burial service, because you remove the cost for the caskets, embalming, a cemetery plot, a grave liner, so it removes some of the most costly items for a funeral service. So cost is, I think, for me personally, the most driving factor. But other factors are things that there is a decline in kind of traditionalism. People's religious views are maybe not as strong as they used to be, and people are more transient, so people are not staying close to where there was maybe a family burial plot. And so the idea of that flexibility of, being able to take mum with you in a urn, if so be it, or even the whole memorial artifact industry now, where people can have, memorial jewellery, they can have cremated remains made into diamonds and bird baths, and so it's sort of a lot more flexible, I think. And I think people, I hear it all the time, particularly from the baby boomer generation, who literally are I don't want any fuss, I just want to be cremated and, scattered where I used to play golf or, whatever it may be.
Right. This is Dying to Bloom, and you are listening to Sara Marsden. She's Director of Communications at DFS Memorials. We are talking about cremation this morning on Dying to Bloom. Kerry Potter, if you'd like to call in. And Sara, let's talk about coffin requirements for a moment, because you are talking about budget, and that is one of the reasons why people choose cremation. What are the coffin requirements, and do they vary by state or location?
The cremation laws actually do vary by state, as do all funeral laws. So there is the federal kind of funeral rule that governs sort of funeral consumers' kind of practices. But each state does have its own law, so they do vary slightly. As far as cremation, the only requirement in every state is that a suitable combustible cremation container is used. In many cases, that is simply a reinforced cardboard box. It's literally that, and it costs about $15, and that cost normally to the consumer will probably be between $30 and anything up to $100, depending upon the cremation services provider. So that dramatically, obviously, reduces costs. Those families that maybe do decide to have a funeral service prior to cremation, many of the providers we work with now are actually offering rental caskets. So instead of the family having to spend $3,000 to $10,000 on a casket, they will rent a casket. Some providers we work with have 2 or 3, so that the family can choose what they feel is suitable. And again, that brings costs down, but still allows the family to, have a funeral service just the same as they would do if the body was going to burial afterwards.
Now, I want to talk about that, and I also would like you to share how people can access the information that DFS Memorials has regarding planning their funeral. But as far as the service goes, and we were talking about the coffin, I just want people to realize that there are a variety of choices. And here in New York, I do know that if you are, first of all, required to work with a funeral director in New York.
That's correct. Yeah, New York is one of only a few states where you do have to employ a funeral director.
Yes, and it's important to be educated on your rights and options when you are planning even your cremation, whether it's for yourself or a loved one. And as far as the coffin goes, as you mentioned, Sara, you can use something as simple as I guess it has to have certain regulation, but there are cardboard boxes. You can do that, or you can spend the money and have a fancier casket. And then you have to think about the service as well. If you do want to if you're going to be cremated and you want to have a funeral service, if you want that open casket, then most funeral homes require you to be embalmed, which is an additional expense. And, of course, something I'm not a big advocate for.
No, me neither.
So I think people should know that, if they're going to have a service, they also have the option to, it's nice for funeral homes to offer the option of renting a coffin if you do want to have a closed casket service and forego the embalming. But also you can choose to have a direct cremation and still have a service after. And I would imagine that's a more cost-effective way to go.
That's absolutely right, Kerry. It is the more effective cost option, really, for a cremation, a direct cremation. And to be quite honest, that's what we're finding the majority of families are steering towards. And sort of like yourself with advocating for green funeral, we kind of believe that this is a more greener option for those families that either are not in a position to do a green burial or do home funeral care. Cremation is seen by many to be a greener option than a traditional burial, because we're not putting kind of fluids and concrete and steel into the ground. And cremated remains, whether you inter them or scatter them, are basically, organic remains. So, and we really feel, for me, I see that the funeral industry is going through this great revolution right now where what was once very traditional and we really just relied upon the funeral home to deliver everything is kind of dividing. So sort of the disposition side and the memorialization side are almost splitting, and the funeral service now is really offering the disposition side, so they can handle the immediate disposition, which is the direct cremation. And then once the family have the cremated remains back, they're kind of free to do their own memorialization, which kind of puts the family back in control a little bit for me. And it also takes away some of those time-critical decisions about trying to arrange a service and get the family together when, families are spread about sometimes these days, or people would prefer a bit of time to recover from, the experience they've gone through in losing somebody before they want to hold a service. So direct cremation certainly is a completely different way of doing it, and in some ways I think is a greener option. And it's also a bit more of a family-led kind of alternative as well.
Yes, and let's just clarify for those listening that direct cremation means. It means here in New York State, the body would be held by a funeral home, depending on, no matter really where the person has passed away, whether they've passed away at home or in a hospital or in a nursing home, then they do get transported to the funeral home because of our laws that require the use of a funeral director. Then you will have to pay for the death certificate and incur certain costs such as that. But then if you want to not spend as much money and choose direct cremation, then you do have the right to purchase or provide your own coffin for the deceased person, which, I think it's important for people to know that they do not have to use a coffin from the funeral home. And, of course, funeral homes don't love for you to know that.
No.
But they do have them online. They do have suitable cardboard containers for cremation online. Perhaps some funeral homes do offer it, but ask. And you have the right to know. You have the right to get a list of the prices for the coffins. You have the right to get a list of all the service fees. And I encourage people to visit funerals.org, which is the Funeral Consumers Alliance, to help you understand what your rights are. And then, Sara, I do want to mention again this show. This is Dying to Bloom. My name is Kerry Potter, and joining me today is Sara Marsden, Director of Communications for DFS Memorials. And the phone number here is 845-362-0013. We do have about 10 minutes left if you'd like to join the conversation, if you have any questions or comments for either of us. But Sara, then can you tell us how you help people plan for a funeral, and does DFS just help as far as cremation, or do you help plan with other types of funeral services?
We certainly help with other types of funeral services. We kind of offer quite a broad spectrum because we also assist families with funeral transportation, which is obviously where families do pass in maybe one state and they need to return to another. So we help them arrange that process as well. And for green burial or for a traditional burial, we basically just want to help families know what their rights are and, help them get through the kind of maelstrom of all the questions often that they want to ask. We actually run state funeral planning guides on our US Funerals website, so we've kind of extensively researched for each state what all the rules and regulations are, and just try and clearly lay those out so families can sometimes get through some of the initial questions that they have about, what they legally can or can't do or what things are going to cost. And we provide a free phone helpline number. So, generally we'll help if somebody rings in and they've got a query, we'll try and help them with that. Very often we've even helped families where, we'll act as the go-between with a funeral home and try and make arrangements if, families are having difficulties. So we just generally, we went through our own experience and realized what a, very difficult time it is, and sometimes people just don't know where to start. So for us, it was just about trying to help people, understand a little bit more about what their rights are, questions about rules and regulations, and to kind of empower them a little bit to ask questions and to know that there are rules to protect them out there, and that's very important to know. And
what is your website and phone number for DFS?
DFS Memorials is dfsmemorials.com. Toll-free number is 800-548-7310.
Do you feel like sharing a little bit about your personal story that enticed you to become involved in this industry?
Yeah, sure. My grandmother passed away in London, England, about 20 years ago, and we just went to the local funeral home that the hospital just recommended us to, which sounded like a local trusted funeral home. I think it was Thomas and Sons Funeral Home. And we were coerced into spending a lot more money than what we'd really planned to. And when we did a little bit of research online afterwards, we found out that this funeral home was actually owned by Service Corporation International, which was a US company which operates out of Houston, Texas. And so we started looking into this and just realizing, just what an industry it is and how the whole corporate-owned side of the funeral industry in the US is, it disconcerts us a little bit that many families don't even realize when they think they're dealing with a little local funeral home that they could be dealing with a big death care corporation. So that's particularly why what we do with DFS Memorials, what we advocate, is we are working with the little family-owned funeral homes, the ones that, struggle to still survive in their town and really they are the genuine guys who really want to work with families and aren't really interested in profits at the end of the day, whereas, I think the billion-dollar death care industry is really more about making money sometimes than really caring about people. So that was how we got into, and from that we were doing some web building, some work at the time, so we bought sort of built the portal for US Funerals Online, and it sort of all went from there.
Really important work. Thank you for doing what you do. And I think it's important for people to realize what you just said, that there are corporate-owned funeral homes as well as the local-owned or...
Yes, I would certainly recommend any family to just, check who they're actually dealing with when they deal with a funeral home, because many of them appear that they're, local. I mean, the biggest one in New York City, Frankie Campbell's, is owned by Service Corporation International, and yet many people just think it's an independent funeral home because it doesn't trade as, Service Corporation International. So,
are there laws regulating the cost of cremation? Because from what I can see, the cost varies from provider to provider. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I don't think there are any specific laws that actually govern cremation costs. Each provider really looks at, what they can operate at. The corporate companies charge far more generally than the local guys. A direct cremation through our network, I think the lowest cost we have for a provider is about $4.95, and it goes up to probably around about $1,500. And certain areas are more expensive than others. It can be to do with gas prices or just legislation or local competition. So in New York, as a state, it can range anywhere from $4.95 up to about $13.95. But then the crematory fee is added on to that because it's the only state where obviously the funeral home can't own the crematory, so they have to add that on as what they call like a cash advance item. It's a third-party payment. So it is one thing to be wary of in New York, that many providers advertise prices that will not include the crematory fee.
Very interesting. So people really should do your homework and price shop.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
DFS Memorials exists to help you to do that. So can you give the website again?
It's dfsmemorials.com.
And I wrote down the 800 number, 800-548-7310. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope... one quick question I have for you.
Sure.
I tried to do a little research and find out more about the environmental impact of cremation. Are you familiar with that? I seem to find some conflicting information. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think where we're at the moment is that it's seen to be less of an impact than traditional burial, as we mentioned earlier. However, there are obviously concerns about emissions, and there's very mixed feelings about this, that the more modern the equipment is today, the more efficient it is, and therefore it's more, environmentally friendly. What's actually happened across Europe, where the cremation rate is much higher and has been for quite some time, is that they have brought in new environmental laws on emissions that have actually meant that many crematories have had to update their equipment, and that has actually had a knock-on impact upon the cost to the consumer. I suspect we might see this happening in the US in years to come as the cremation rate increases, so we'll have to watch on that. So right now, cremation prices are making it very affordable, but the likelihood is it may go up.
And there are new technologies being developed and being used in various parts of the country. One is the alkaline hydrolysis,
yes,
which is it's similar to a cremation, except it uses water and potassium hydroxide, which when heated dissolves the body. So that doesn't use the fossil fuels or release the carbons that traditional cremation does. However, it does use water and energy, so I don't know how much better that may or may not be. That is legal in some states, but currently not in New York. And then I've also learned a little bit about promescin. Is that how you say it? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah,
promescin.
I'm not kind of quite sure exactly how you pronounce it, but that's where they kind of freeze-dry the remains. And
right. They're frozen in liquid nitrogen and then shaken until they disintegrate into a powder. So new technologies are constantly developing. Cremation as we know it, as you mentioned, seems to be improving as far as the process and efficiency, and improving in popularity because we have to think about sustainability as far as death and burial. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the conversation before we wrap it up, Sarah?
No, I'd just like to say, as well as DFS Memorials, we obviously run the website US Funerals Online, which has a lot of information. We have a library section where we've looked at each state extensively at either just funeral planning laws or cremation laws by state. And we also have quite a lot of articles on there about green burials, which states allow which things, and just general. We generally try and help families get as much information as they can to be informed to make the right decisions for them, really.
So is that a separate?
That's separate to DFS Memorials, yes. That's just a completely separate funeral information website that we operate.
Well, Sara, thank you so much for joining me today on Dying to Bloom, and thank you for all the wonderful work you do in educating people on their burial choices and costs, and help us to think about what really is the best way to go.
The best way to go. Thank you very much for inviting me, Kerry.
Again, this is Sara Marsden, Director of Communications at DFS. And Sara, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you, Kerry.
Bye-bye. Before I do wrap up, I just wanted to give a few facts, I should say, about cremation that I found out as I did a little research preparing for this show. I found it kind of interesting that you cannot test cremated remains for DNA. So once that process happens, the DNA is destroyed in the process. And I thought, what do cremated remains look like? Do they look like ashes? And I hear, which I haven't seen them myself, they're a little more coarse and sand and can contain bone fragments. And after the cremation process, there are bones left that become smashed or in a cremator. There's actually a machine that does that as well following the cremation process. A couple of other quick things before we wrap up. Pacemakers that contain lithium batteries are removed prior to cremation, since the lithium batteries have been found to explode in high temperatures and cause major damage to the cremation chamber. The modern cremation does not involve the use of flames. Instead, a body is reduced to ashes or cremains as a result of being exposed to the intense heat. And finally, metal objects such as dental gold, screws, hinges, and prosthesis are often broken down into smaller pieces during the process, and then they're retrieved from the cremation chamber using an magnet. Then these metal pieces are disposed of according to local law, and in some cases, cremation providers have found surgical devices in cremation chambers, such as scissors and forceps. I guess it's too late at that point to go back to the doctor that may have left them there. But I hope you enjoyed today's show on cremation. Green burials is my first choice personally. However, you can attach a spiritual element to the smoke burling up in the air as a release of the spirit, and to think that there are molecules of your deceased loved one in the air, I think that could be a little comforting. Being cremated may be your last hope for a smoking body. I hope you enjoyed today's show. May thinking and making educated decisions about your death also encourage you to make the best of your life. I'm Kerry Potter. Talk to you next month on Dying to Bloom.